Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be something a little bit different today, this first lesson of the new term. I'm going to be looking at a painting in progress that I have going on, which is a sort of nightscape painting, night cityscape I suppose. And it's kind of maybe midway through the process, and I wanted to kind of go through it and analyse my thought process at this point in a painting. So when you've got something kind of reasonably well established, but you kind of need to push it a bit further. And it's also something a little bit different to look at in terms of subject matter and time of day for landscapes. Most of the landscape type things we've done have been during the day. So I'm going to start just by popping my camera off the tripod here and just kind of breaking it down, things that I've been working on, my approach, that sort of thing. It's an interesting piece, this, because we're looking at lots of different light sources. We're not working with a single light source, so you can kind of see on this side that there are warm and cool lights hitting these leaves. That's because there's a kind of one bluish light that's kind of shining from the left hand side of the image, which is illuminating these bits of grass. And then there's some kind of warm ambient light coming from this side of the image, the street lamp, which is shining through these leaves. So some of the leaves we're looking at light shining through the back of them, and they're more yellow, and then some are more blue, and they're catching that not street lamp, sorry, it's like a it's a colder fluorescent lamp. And you also get, so from that you're getting some warm colours in the shadows being filled by the street lamp, which is quite golden. And then in the very back here we've got some more kind of bluish lights within the context of those yellow lights. So the bus shelter has blue light, so that's a case of colour temperature coming off the light source. And finally, the last part of the kind of complex arrangement of lights that we've got going on is this large window. It's the back of a train station, and this window is very bright. It's actually coloured, but it's got kind of like changing colours that come through. But at the moment, it's staying white, and I'm going to be glazing it. Probably not today, because it'll be the final thing I do in this piece. I'm just going to pop the camera back on. Oh, actually, I'm just having a look at the kind of layering of the painting. You can see in this portion of the background the initial block-in, which is quite washy, and then as the paint started to be layered up, it's getting thicker. So I'm building impastos throughout the process. You can also see some of the initial kind of scratchier, washier block-in underneath this section of the painting. And that's because it just creates an interesting kind of relationship of textures throughout the piece. So we've got a lot of different textures going on. We've got the grass, the tree trunks, which are slightly different, then the leaves, the road. We've got bits of brick and stone running through it. A lot to work with, so it's a pretty complex piece. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of work in front of you a bit and go through what I'm doing and why, that sort of thing. And all relates to things we've done before during other lessons. And I'm going to primarily be focusing on this section of the tree, which is quite useful. So it's obviously being painted in detail. Sometimes when I talk about landscape paintings, I mention kind of simplifying trees, and you'll notice, maybe we'll have seen these trees in the background are quite simplified, but these foreground trees, because of the complexity of the piece, I'm keeping pretty complex, or fairly kind of detailed in their rendering. And there's also, so there's a lot of contrast. You'll notice there's very deep blacks. So in these deep blacks, I'm using a fairly sophisticated palette. Got a mixture of Prussian blue and alizarin crimson, which you can kind of lay on as pure alizarin crimson or Prussian blue and get a semi-impressionistic effect, which is what I've gone for here. If you mix them, they sort of neutralize into a kind of blackish color. I'm also using pure black, pure ivory black as well, just to get a bit more depth into it through this section here. So there's no light really reaching that part of that bush, which is why it's got so dark. It's also nearest to us in the image, so even if there were things that are kind of pure black back here, they're not going to be as deeply black as these foreground sections, foreground elements just working through this bit. So that's something to bear in mind when you're kind of formulating your relationships, your contrast relationships or value relationships. So if I pick up where I've kind of been roughly working recently, we're trying to sort of create a sense of light falling on this, the leaves within this tree. So that comes from looking at kind of pools of certain types of light. So there's a lot of yellow light coming through this top left corner of the image, not the image, of the bush. So quite a lot of strong yellows coming through here that we want to catch, sort of pooling almost. So it doesn't matter if they merge as I paint them. If I paint pure cadmium yellow, so this is cadmium yellow I'm working with now, into white on the canvas, you get quite a nice sort of intense effect. So that light that's kind of pooling on the left hand side is also creeping around the right as well. So you sort of start to see if we do this, if we start to carry this type of lighting through, you get a sense that this tree is casting sort of something of a shadow over the foliage. So even though I'm not kind of blocking it in as a mass, you still get a sense of the form of the bush, and that's quite important in this instance because the bush does have quite an obvious form. It's one of these kind of very well groomed bushes. So it's been cut into this shape around the tree. Which means we want to capture that shape, which it definitely very prominently has, and that means kind of looking for this shadow cast by the tree over the shape. We've also got some nice sections of leaves that kind of stick out in different positions. As I'm working on something like this, I blur my eyes quite a lot. Because it's sort of impression based. It's not just exactly copying things. You just want to do whatever's necessary to give the right impression of these leaves. So that's what we mostly care about. So there's another kind of something of a shadow cast over the bush just here. I think it's something off screen that's causing that to happen. But we also want to give a suggestion of that. That means sort of darkening anything too intense that's going on just at that point. I'm also flicking between, as I mentioned earlier, between sort of bluish greens and yellowish greens, because it's the same leaves obviously catching the light, but they're catching the light from a different source. So some of them are having light pass through them because leaves are transparent and others are being illuminated directly with that sort of bluish light. So I'm trying to think about which light is illuminating these leaves at any given time, and then modulating my color based on that, so I can kind of flick between my mixtures of my Prussian blue and cadmium yellow as my kind of base leaf mixture. When they need to be more bluish, I use more Prussian blue, and when they need to be more yellow, I use more cadmium yellow, which makes it reasonably manageable to control, which is good. So you can see there we've now got more of a sense of that section of the bush having a shadow cast over it. And that's just by thinking about which portion of it has what sort of particular type of form or value, and then kind of adhering the form to those values. The other thing you don't want to do when you're painting something like this is get too regular. So every now and then have a little bit of a stop and think about where values or colours, certain values or colours are massing. And if they're getting too regular, kind of like if I was just dotting dot 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 all my brush strokes all over the same place, it starts to get a bit boring to look at. So something we want to do with our landscape paintings is look for variety that always exists in life or from life. So it's never entirely regular, something like a tree. There's always a rhythm to it, and it's that rhythm that makes it interesting to look at the image, and also quite beautiful when working from nature. Similar when we're working from a portrait or a figure, when we look for edge variety. So that's what we're looking for in the landscape too. If you find you've mixed up a colour that I can't actually find anywhere else specifically to use that colour on the tree, so I've just shifted and I'm using what I've mixed up. Actually works quite well as a kind of half tone in the grasses, the grass, light shapes of the grass. You can also look for overlaps. So there's obviously a point here where some grass is visible behind these leaves. So you could look for what happens at that point where they overlap. Probably going to get some little bits of light cutting back into the leaves. Likewise, if we're looking at the point where the leaves overlap the road, you're going to get some little bits that are not transparent, but see-through. So we want to catch those as well. So you can see, even with quite loose brushwork, we can start to get a sense of detail, but also volume into a form like this tree. And it's the interaction with light that I'm most interested in this piece. The reason I chose this subject is just because there's so much going on in terms of light throughout the whole image. Makes it very interesting to look at. So now I'm going to go back and just strengthen some of the blues in the shadowy sections of this painting. Then look for some highlights within this darker. So there are these kind of lighter bluish highlights within the shadow, catching some of those shadowy leaves. So I'm going to try to capture that as well, but keeping that localized to the shadow that's being cast over the form of the shrub. That's starting to look quite good. So we can now, I'm going to carry on looking at kind of where the there's a bit of overlap between these lower grassy forms and the leaves. So maybe finding some blues within the grass is nice. It creates a vibration, a visual vibration. So a lot of the colours in the grass are kind of more yellowy. So if we start to introduce some blues, some quite strong blues, it starts to make those colours vibrate against each other. So from a distance, as we step back from it, those yellows and blues start to blend together visually and create a green. So obviously if you put enough blue and yellow next to each other on a painting and you stood well back from it, at a certain point those colours will merge and form a greenish colour. So that's what we're trying to suggest here. And what it does, rather than mixing it, you end up with something that vibrates. And vibration is a really useful tool when working on a landscape. You can do it in anything, so you can do it with figures and portraits as well. But particularly in a landscape, because you're looking at a whole field that's atmospheric, you want to create a sense of vibration. And that's what was really important to the Impressionists. So the whole principle of Impressionism relied on the concept of colour fields vibrating. So if you place two strong colours next to one another, they can mix visually to form a new colour. And even though I'm doing something quite tight, so it's not what you would typically consider Impressionist maybe, traditionally, it benefits from using, kind of appropriating that technique. I might make a little document actually just to accompany this video and talk about colour vibration, because it's an important and very useful technique to use, and it's something that a lot of you might be familiar with if you've studied or seen much Impressionist work, and I'm sure all of you can think of Impressionism as an approach and how that works, and then how you could extend it into something like this painting. So this is obviously a very layered painting. So I've probably done, prior to this video, I'd maybe done about 4 or 5 passes over the painting, plus a bit of time on site. So I actually took it at night and was painting it. But these sorts of paintings you build up gradually. Very often in the studios you can do a mixture of the studio and outdoors, like I did with this one. But you're going to struggle to get something like this down in a single pass, obviously. You're going to have to have a few stabs at it in order to really capture all the detail, if you wanted to go this detailed with it. And you also, the layering helps you kind of create a distinction, like I was saying, between these looser backgrounds. That's something I could come in and tighten up if necessary, but I don't have to. I kind of move backwards and forwards with the image, so sometimes I'll be working in the foreground, sometimes move to the background, and just try to create the right balance and make the eye move through the image the way that I want it to. So it's obviously a complex composition, but we do have some certain kind of versions of duplication going on. So there's this arch shape here in the main window, which is replicated in the arch shape of the bush surrounding this tree. And then we've got kind of cutaway arches all the way in the back of the railway line behind. So there's a nice kind of repetition of shapes. There's also these repetition of these little stumpy bits of gate. Then we've got a duplication of the tree, and both trees are just about the same distance away from the edge of the painting, so it doesn't quite cut it into thirds, but it creates a certain sense of balance. So despite being a really complex subject, and this is pretty much how it was in real life, so it took a little bit of time to fiddle around and figure out exactly where I was going to paint. So despite being quite a complex subject, it was possible to create a nice balanced composition. And then within, because it's so long, within the composition you get different little subjects. So that little bus stop in the distance is a nice kind of, almost a tiny painting in its own right. Similarly, this style, or whatever it's called, the gate has a nice bright yellow highlight on the top of it. And the other thing we want to think about is, as I was painting, you notice that some of these values are actually pure white, and you wouldn't generally think if you're doing a night painting you could go to pure white, except possibly in the actual light source themselves. But you can get away, so even though these are little pure white notes in this tree, it doesn't feel like it's out of place. It just it works contextually, just because it's got the right level of balance between darks and lights, and only using light and the very little accents that we're going for. And then primarily everything is darker. But the sense of night and day is more to do with value relationships than how dark the colour is locally. So for instance, if I wanted to boost the highlight on the top of this arm, I can, and it reads alright. It doesn't read that it's super bright, and that's almost pure white. We'd save our purest pure whites for the highlights within these light sources on the right hand side, but to create sense of balance you don't want to just have no pure lights in this left hand side of the painting, because it'll feel like everything's really bright on that side. So you can get away with kind of modulating your lights within an image, and that can work quite well. The other thing you'll notice when you're painting something like this, and it's something I'm starting to struggle with a bit now, if you keep working on the same part of a painting for a sustained period of time, you'll start to kind of be painting a bit too much wet into wet, which doesn't always give the right impression. So some of these brushstrokes work better as crisp brushstrokes over a dry surface. If I was painting them directly into a wet surface, they can look a bit smudgier, which is great for certain things. So like you could work on something like the grass in a smudgy way, because we want to give a certain softness on this back side. You can even start to blend things a bit with a kitchen towel or another brush with your finger if you were going for a smudgier look. But if you're going for these sorts of crisp little notes of detail, you need to be aware of whether you're working wet into wet or not, basically. But yeah, that's a little bit of a kind of overview of this piece. I might do a follow-up in a few weeks once it's complete, and go through how I approached kind of finishing it, and you can see a difference between the two. But I thought it might be useful because we don't always get to kind of look into more complex projects in this course, because it's nice to kind of jump between different subjects. But I thought it would be good to have a look midway and then when the piece is actually completed. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting to you guys. If you have any questions, obviously post below, and sign up to the YouTube group for new lessons. And if you want to sign up to OCAD, you can follow the link below for support from me and my fellow tutors. Yeah, hopefully that was interesting, and I'll see you guys soon.